Hello and welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. First order of business today is to confirm the obvious. Yes, this show has moved to a new time slot and it all happened very fast, too fast, and that didn't give me the chance to announce it in advance. But that's okay. If you're listening or watching live right now, then I guess you'll know where to find me from now on. And if you are subscribed to one of KGRA's many catch up streaming and podcast forums, then you might not have even noticed that I've changed times. But yes, Human Ascension with Ellie has moved to Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. I think that's prime time. It feels nice and comfy here, and I think we'll stay for a little while. Why not? Anyway, don't worry though, this won't affect you at all if you're listening in on Facebook or Spreaker, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or any other catch up forum. Anywho, today's episode is the last in the three-part trilogy, the three-part series that I've been doing. In part one, we talked about Helena Blavatsky, the very free-thinking Ukrainian mystic who, in the mid to late 1800s, spent most of her time traveling the world, researching the occult, and seeking out the wisdoms of spirituality and the cosmos. Helena wrote two highly influential books that form the basis for much of what the spiritual and esoteric experts, or even the world in general, are still talking about today. Helena's first book was called Isis Unveiled. It was around 1,200 pages in length and was a comprehensive exploration of esoteric philosophy, delving into the spiritual and occult teachings of ancient and modern science and theology. It connected Eastern and Western philosophies, challenging the materialism of scientific and religious institutions that were in place during Helena's time on Earth. Helena's second book, The Secret Doctrine, was even longer at, I think they said, between 1,400 to 1,500 pages, and it is by far her most famous book. The Secret Doctrine comprised of two volumes. One volume talked about the creation of the cosmos, and the second volume provided a detailed explanation of humanity's creation and how it evolved from its inceptions all the way into how it will evolve into the future. Helena Blavatsky's lifelong devotion to researching the occult resulted in her co-founding the Theosophical Society, an organization, which is dedicated to continuing the study of esoteric philosophy. The Theosophical Society still exists today and has branches and satellite groups all over the world. I actually recall visiting the Society's library in Melbourne, Australia, when I was younger and when I lived closer to the city. I haven't been there recently, but back then I used to love to just hang out and flick through the many weird and wonderful books on display. I really, really do need to make a point of visiting the Society again soon. I understand their library is even more modern and beautifully and comfortably set up right now. So I will. Anywho, in part two of this series, we talked about how Helena Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, how it described the creation and evolution of humanity, and how it also described the manner in which we exist here on Earth, how long we're expected to be here, how our evolution has been divided into 7 cycles of what Helena describes to be the root races. And according to The Secret Doctrine, we're currently in the 5th root race and have been evolving here on Earth for over 100 million years. We began as the first root race, an ethereal, one-dimensional presence with no language, no physical form, and no concept of our own existence. We then evolved into what the book calls the second root race, which is referred to as the Hyperboreans. They were a hybrid, physical, ethereal entity that laid eggs as a method of reproduction. And then, as the third root race, or the Lemurians, we began to take on a familiar physical form. And by the end of that stage, we had begun to appear much as we do now. The Secret Doctrine explains that even today, in the 5th root race, some of the world's indigenous people continue to carry fragments of Lemurian traits, particularly those of darker skin color or in certain areas of the world. The fourth root race was the Atlanteans, a fully formed physical being that ranged in size from what we might consider to be normal, but also to giant-sized entities. Collectively, the Atlanteans were highly psychic, physically and intellectually superior to any other human manifestation. But they were also a bit naughty and somehow managed to get themselves destroyed in what sounded quite a lot like an intergalactic war or an ET invasion or something like that, but with aspects to it that also appear reminiscent of the great flood stories that appear in religious scripture and ancient mythologies all over the world. The Secret Doctrine explains how humanity is currently in this fifth root race, but is rapidly accelerating in a descendant path towards the sixth root race. In fact, Helena Blavatsky wrote in her book that there are already individuals advanced enough in their spiritual or intellectual evolution to embody the sixth root race qualities. And so, they might be the people that we see that seem to not quite fit in with the rest of us here on Earth. And then the final root race stage is the seventh root race, at which point humanity will evolve back into that ethereal presence as it prepares to depart this world experience and begin an entirely new cycle of what the Secret Doctrine refers to as Manvantara, or earthly cycle of evolution, on another entirely different planet in the cosmos. By the time humanity has finally left this earthly evolutionary experience, this Manvantara, it would have resided here on this planet for 308 million years. Incredible. So, before we left last week's episode, I began telling you about what happened to Helena Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, after she passed away in the late 1880s, or maybe 1891, I think, because suddenly Helena's teachings, which she had painstakingly transcribed from what she claimed was being dictated to her by an ascendant master. Well, shortly after her passing, an Austrian writer and occultist by the name of Guido von List appropriated, or in other words, stole Helena Blavatsky's concepts of root races and transformed them to support his German nationalist ideology. This promoted the idea of a superior Aryan German race. Helena's book, The Secret Doctrine, had referred to this fifth root race that we currently live in as the Aryan race. However, the book had originally described the Aryan race as referring to all humans that resided in this fifth root race, this stage of evolution. In fact, Helena referred to Indian Aryans, European Aryans, and various others. The term Aryan was a descriptor for a race of beings that had arisen from the previous Atlantean fourth root race. So basically all humans, not just excluding certain ones and only including other ones. And the only distinction between them was geographic, which then divided all of the Aryan human race into ethnic families so that their similarities and differences could be discussed in the book. Guido von List changed that. He took the root race concept and then artificially elevated the Germanic people so that they were described in his rewriting of Helena's philosophy as being superior to any other race. And when you study his backstory, which I go into in a bit of detail in last week's episode, it really does sound as though he was just one of those pampered, rich fellows with very little to do to pass the time, who was suffering from a physical ailment for a year or so. So he ended up spending his convalescent period just rewriting something so that he could feed his own ego and feel better about himself. That's what it sounded like, really. Little did Guido von List know at the time that his fantasy philosophy would ultimately lead to one of the most shocking and cruel events in human history. So Guido von List also started an esoteric society of his own, but it didn't really go anywhere, and it disbanded after he died a few years later in 1919. The only thing is, Guido's work was now out there, and shortly after his passing, the idea of his superior race of humans, the Aryans, became the perfect propaganda tool for a small number of men in Europe who were looking to do big things, big, bad things. So, how did Helena Blavatsky, the Theosophical Society, and Helena's book, The Secret Doctrine, all of which were focused on the discovery and translation of spiritual esoteric answers about reality and the existence of all life? I mean, Helena Blavatsky never made any mention of a superior Germanic race of Aryans. The Theosophical Society even declared in its earliest statements of purpose, when it was first conceived, that it was a society open to every kind of creed and person, regardless of ethnic origin or other characteristic. And the Secret Doctrine book is clearly just a space in which the questions of life and reality are attempting to be explained in the most equalizing manner of ways. So, how did all of this get swept up into the Nazi Party's propaganda machine? Well, in order to understand what happened, we need to get an understanding of what was happening at the time with humanity. There were two convergences of things taking place, and they were about to collide with one another. One of those things was politics, and the other was this search for esoteric wisdom. So let's take a look at the political side first. The German National Socialist Workers' Party was first created in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. In September 1919, Adolf Hitler joined the party. In 1920, he became the leader of the party, and the name of the party was changed to the Nazi Party. Now, the word Nazi is actually an abbreviation of two German words, which were designed to blend the nationalist sentiment of the right-wing population with the socialist sentiment of the left-wing population. Hence, nationalism plus socialism or socialism equals Nazism. Before the rise of the party, the word Nazi actually was a derogatory term for someone who was considered to be a backward peasant or an awkward and clumsy person, a bit like the way that the MAGA element tried to incorporate a sense of pride in the word deplorable after Hillary Clinton referred to people as being deplorable. Well, they did the same thing with the word Nazi. The Nazi Party promoted a nationalist and racist ideology and capitalized on the economic instability and widespread discontent that was present in Germany during the time. It appealed particularly to young, unemployed, disgruntled men, and Adolf Hitler was particularly successful in appealing to those men. He was often described to be a brilliant speaker, and once his skill for maintaining the attention of an audience and catering to their emotional sense of betrayal or fear or anger was realized, well, he was able to very quickly transform from a fledgling new member to the party to the ruthless leader of the party that he ultimately became. He did, in fact, demonstrate his ruthlessness very quickly, right from the beginning, by threatening to quit the party unless they put him into a leadership position. And they listened to him because he was such a charismatic speaker on their behalf. And so he did that. They put him into the role, which is where he remained as party's leader for the rest of his existence. A few decades earlier, two theorists had been independently promoting the idea of a superior race. The first was Arthur de Gobineau, a French aristocratic novelist. De Gobineau had developed a theory of racial superiority called An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, in which he argued that the decline of civilizations was due to racial mixing. De Gobineau's ideas were influenced by the social and political context of the time, which included the rise of nationalism and colonialism. So the second theorist was Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a British German philosopher who wrote works about political philosophy and natural science. Actually, I think his name was Houston, not Houston. His writing promoted German ethno nationalism, anti Semitism, scientific racism, and Nordicism, which is a term that's used for ideologies claiming that people of Nordic origin are superior to other races. Chamberlain lived in England and had written a book called The Foundations of the 19th Century, where he expanded on de Gobineau's earlier book and went further to glorify the concepts of German nationalism and racial purity. As we know, people like to hang out with other like minded people. That's just the way we are. And so it was that Adolf Hitler, in an attempt to continue to provide powerful speeches and new methods to evoke emotional responses from his crowds, well, he was spending time exchanging ideas and theories of the plight of the Germans, the working class, and the power enhancement of the Nazi Party. He was spending his time talking like that with people who were like minded. And it was through word of mouth and shared ideology that Hitler became acquainted with the works of de Gobineau and Chamberlain, along with other theorists, including the German writer and musical composer Richard Wagner, who, I'm sure you've guessed it, was known for his anti Semitism and other racist comments and his German nationalist views. They were all hanging out, people like minded. The next political aspect of the Nazi Party's strength came from the SS. Now, SS stands for Schutzstaffel, which translates in English to Protection Squadron. The SS was formed in 1925 as a small bodyguard unit for Hitler, because by the time he'd been leader of the Nazi Party for 5 years, it had grown significantly because of his charismatic speeches. But it was also beginning to get under the establishment's skin with its racial ideology and the threatening, angry crowd responses that would occur during speeches. Over the next few years, as the Nazi Party grew exponentially, so did the SS. It ultimately grew into one of the most powerful and feared organizations in Nazi Germany and German-occupied Europe during World War II. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. In 1934, a year later, the President of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, died. It was at this time that Hitler merged the Chancellor and the President roles together and became this omnipowerful leader of Nazi Germany. So the final ingredient in the political equation, which actually helps us to cross over into the esoteric side of the story, came from the German faith movement. Now, the German faith movement was a religious movement that began in 1933 in direct response to the new Nazi government's attempts to indoctrinate children into Christianity. So they were opposed to the Nazi government in the first instance. The movement sought to replace traditional Christian beliefs with a new kind of faith that was rooted in Germanic paganism and Nazi principles of racial superiority and nationalist socialism. Initially, the German faith movement invited a wide variety of free thinkers into the movement, but as its ideology started to become broadly radicalized, it began excluding people who didn't conform to racial ideology, to the group's racial ideology. And then this began to morph outward, and the ideology itself began to change. And over a short period of time, only a few years later, the German faith movement had begun propagating the idea of racial purity and the mass expunging of Jews from the movement based on their failure to meet the purity criteria. So the convergence of the Nazi Party, the SS, and the German faith movement was based on a number of factors that progressed around 10 to 15 years in time. Firstly, they identified each other as having shared common goals and ideologies. primarily when it came to the concepts of nationalism and racial purity and the militarized enforcement of those principles. But also, it was a marriage of convenience because you see, without a religious movement to refer back to, the Nazi Party and its military protection group were really just a bunch of thugs. But with religion on their side, they could claim a divine purpose. And so, the German faith movement provided a religious framework that supported Nazi ideas and gave the Nazi propaganda machine a means by which to manipulate perceptions and align ordinary people to the Nazi movement through their sense of religion and faith. So let me pause here for a moment and allow us to sort of let that sink in. The Nazi Party was this new government with Adolf Hitler at its head. The SS was this militarized protection bodyguard unit that he had that just grew and grew and grew out of necessity because he was exciting things. He'd upset the establishment and the crowds were getting bigger. And so the military protection of him had to get bigger as well. But Adolf Hitler and his SS military group were just a bunch of thugs. They were just this tyrannical presence. What they needed was they needed something to soften them. And what softens, this element of faith and belief and godliness. So the German faith movement was a religious movement that gave a sense of credibility and divine purpose to these thugs. Now, if you're listening, you tell me whether any of this sounds at all familiar, because it sounds as though it's familiar to me. So let's move on to the esoteric side of this story. Helena Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, had provided insight into how the Aryan races of humanity in the fifth root race had emerged from the diverse characteristics that had survived the destruction of Atlantis. She wrote that after the airborne intervention of fire weapons, that's the terms used, against the sorcerers of Atlantis, also terms used, and the great flood that destroyed their fourth root race, that, and I quote, some yellow, some brown, some black, and some red of the previous race still remained. And these characteristics of the fourth root race had evolved into the fifth root race, the humans that we are today. However, the name for this particular evolutionary cycle of humans has been labeled the Aryans, and that's the entire fifth root race, regardless of yellow, black, brown, or red. And according to Helena Blavatsky, these Aryans would lead humanity forward spiritually. In her book, Helena divided the Aryan race into broad categories, including the Aryan Hindus, who she explained were derived from the oldest parts of the fifth root race, the Semite Aryan Hebrews, who were derived from the newest parts of the fifth root race, and the Europeans as well, who were from Aryan Europeans, who were from various different stages of the Aryan race, but who could trace their roots to India. Helena Blavatsky described how humanity was presently derived from all of these originating Aryan families. But in the future, as we evolve into the sixth and seventh root races, she said that we would shed our gender identity and we would transform from physical to ethereal properties, and we will eventually return to a spiritual form. And that the final product of our existence on Earth in this 308 million year cycle of Manvantara and human evolution would result in our achieving our utopian future. What Helena Blavatsky's philosophy of theosophy was stating was that the Aryans were a superior race to rise from those who had perished in previous races, and that in our present and future embodiments, we would take ourselves into the future. That's it. That's what she was saying, because every time a race dies to make a new race born, It's assumed that the purpose of the death and rebirth is to evolve in a positive direction. And so each race that emerges from the past races is deemed to be superior in that moment, but only in that moment. Because what Helena's works also stated was that the Aryan race would also be replaced with the races of the sixth and seventh race for exactly the same reason. When Guido von List plagiarized Helena Blavatsky, he changed her work. He reinterpreted the word superior to mean better rather than progressively traveling forward, and he limited it to a particular ethnicity, the Germanic family of the Aryan root race. And all of this is documented when you look at her work compared to his work. At no time whatsoever did Helena Blavatsky or the Theosophical Society or even Theosophy as a philosophical concept ever refer to the Germanic people as being superior or pure compared to other people. Now, I don't want to spend the rest of today's episode talking about idiots. Okay, not that I have an opinion. So I'll just summarize the collective works rather than naming each of these idiots specifically. But I think you'll get the general gist of why I'm calling them idiots in just a moment. Each of these idiots was deeply interested in and often wrote about occultism and paganism in their own style and to their own preferences. So one of these idiots wrote a book about what he called theozoology, where he claimed that a few Aryans committed bestiality with lower species, and this created a different branch of humans, separate from the pure Aryans. And that's how he explains how the Germanics are superior. Another of these idiots spent his life longing for a return of a highly romanticized and imaginary past when Germans worshipped the old gods long before the current religious framework. In his view, Christianity had corrupted the people, which is why paganism was the way to go. Another of these idiots described or decided that an interpretation of ancient Greek writings about the Germanic origins placed the German ancestry as being geographically native to the North Pole originally. And another one of these idiots founded an occult society called the Order of Germans that immediately began placing ads for blonde-haired, blue-eyed men and women of Aryan descent to join the society. So think about all of those idiots. If you put all of those idiots together and throw in a few other good idiots for good measure, what ultimately happens is the founding of an offshoot society called the Thule Society. The Thule Society and its mix of idiots ended up being what linked the political and esoteric elements of Nazism together. And it all boiled down to an ancient symbol. So it's weird how things turn out. It really is quite weird sometimes. So, the Theosophical Society has been using an ancient symbol in its seal for quite a number of years, well, since its inception. The symbol in question is the swastika. The swastika is an ancient symbol with deep roots in both Buddhism and Hinduism, and it was that long before it was appropriated by the Nazis. Now, I'm saying appropriated, and I like to use the word appropriated as a gentler way of saying stolen, distorted, bastardized, or misappropriated. Okay. But anyway, it was appropriated by the Nazis many thousands of years later. And it's a shame because the Nazis used the swastika symbol for an entirely different purpose than it was originally intended. So, for example, in Buddhism, the swastika is a symbol of good fortune, prosperity, abundance, and eternity. The term swastika comes from the Sanskrit word swastika, which is an abbreviation of other words. The swa part means good. The asti part means to be, and the ka part is a suffix that sort of joins it all together. So swastika sort of means to be good. The swastika in Buddhism represents Buddha's footsteps and is often found on statues, particularly on the soles of Buddha's feet or on his heart. It embodies the Dharma wheel, which is also known as the wheel of law, which represents the path to enlightenment and nirvana. The swastika in Buddhism is seen to be a representation of omnipotence, fortune, and diversity. Diversity. Okay, let me just repeat that a few more times for the white supremacists who might be sitting in the back. The swastika represents diversity in Buddhism. Okay, I think they've heard me now. Let's move on. So the swastika is used in Buddhism to mark the beginning of Buddhist texts, and it's considered a symbol of luck and is commonly found in temples, monasteries, and a wide variety of religious artifacts that can be traced back to Buddhism teachings. The swastika has a similar meaning in Hinduism. Now remember, Hinduism was of great interest to Helena Blavatsky. It's a sacred symbol that represents well-being, prosperity, and good fortune. In Hinduism, the meaning of the word swastika is literally means conducive to well-being. The purpose of the swastika, facing clockwise in Hinduism, is to symbolize the sun. And when the swastika faces counterclockwise in Hinduism, it refers to a Hindu goddess by the name of Kali, along with the cyclical motions of life and reality, and what's referred to as the 4 stages of life, or the 4 Vedas. And this is actually really interesting. So let's digress into those four stages of the Veda stages. So in Hinduism, life is traditionally divided into 4 stages, known as ashramas. Each stage represents a different phase of life with its own duties and responsibilities. The first stage of life is referred to as the student stage. This stage is dedicated to education and learning. It typically lasts until around the age of 25. During this time, individuals focus on acquiring knowledge, developing character, and practicing celibacy. Apparently, the student lives with a guru or a teacher and learns both spiritual and practical knowledge. The second stage of life is referred to as the household stage. This stage begins with marriage and involves taking on family responsibilities. People in this stage of life focus on earning a living, raising a family, and contributing to society. It's considered the most important stage for fulfilling social and economic duties. The householder stage lasts until around about the age of 50. Now, the third stage of life, represented on the swastika, is referred to as the hermit stage. I can happily state that I'm squarely and comfortably fitting right into the hermit stage. So this stage marks a gradual withdrawal from worldly life. People in the hermit stage retire from their professional and social responsibilities. They focus on spiritual practicalities or practices, meditation, and living a simple life. For those who raised families, it tends to start when the person's children are grown and become self-sufficient. And then we've got the fourth and final stage of life, represented by the swastika, which is referred to as the renunciate stage. This stage involves renouncing all material possessions and attachments. People in the renunciate stage of life dedicate themselves entirely to spiritual pursuits and seeking liberation. They live a life of simplicity, sometimes even nomadic in nature, and they often depend upon the support of others, including the younger generations. This fourth stage is generally all about focusing on achieving union with the divine and letting go of all of the material constraints that propelled previous life stages. The Hindus believe that these 4 life stages provide a framework for living a balanced and fulfilling life, with each stage building upon the previous one. So, the swastika and its four legs, when in counterclockwise, are actually referring to the four stages of life in Hinduism. And also, when it comes to Buddhism, one of the most important things to remember is that there's a representation there of diversity, diversity, diversity. So, as you can see, the swastika has a rich and beautiful history that was born from really positive, inclusive Buddhist and Hindu teachings. It is still a symbol that can be found on shop doors, vehicles, religious statues, letterheads, and signs around India, in the same way that the number 8 is an important sort of symbol in Chinese teachings. The swastika is important in India. And the cross, of course, is central to Christianity, and so on. The swastika is still a very powerful, positive symbol of well-being and spirituality in these ancient religions. However, the whole point of being an idiot is to make something beautiful suddenly look ridiculous and grotesque. And so, in true idiot form, the Thule Society also adopted the swastika. And because it was an entirely different kind of society, it filled with aristocratic men who had never performed any work in any real work in their lives and had only ever lived aristocratically because they had inherited their social standing and fortune from people before them. And because they had nothing to really do that was of meaning in their lives, they sought to manufacture a close association with something that did have meaning. And so they chose the swastika. And then they distorted its meaning with deeply racist ideologies. Not that I have an opinion or anything like that. Anywho, there are plenty of people out there who will immediately jump up and down and declare that Hitler has nothing to do with esotericism. They'll say that he didn't believe in or have any interest in spiritual matters, whether ancient wisdoms or the origins of humanity. However, I'm afraid to say that those people are incorrect. They're wrong. Because not that long ago, something interesting was found in the Library of Congress in Washington. And it kind of proves that Hitler was deeply interested in occult practices, particularly as it related to the Aryan root races. I guess that's the way it works, isn't it? If you have an idea of what you'd like to believe, then it always helps to go looking for something that you believe will support your viewpoint. I think they call it confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, by the way, is when a person goes looking for any kind of information that they can find that might confirm their pre-existing beliefs. They may also selectively interpret information so that they filter out anything they don't already believe in, and they will only remember the messages that they are comfortable with or which match their preconceived ideas. And in Hitler's case, he desperately wanted to be a big guy, and he'd been marketing the superiority of blonde, white, blue-eyed German men and women in his Nazi movement. So he actively went looking for evidence to prove himself right. And when he found the reinterpretations of the Aryan race theory that were actually nothing more than a distorted version of theosophical teachings, he latched onto it. The reason why we know this is because of something that was published in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in May of 2003. It was an article by a fellow called Timothy Ryback, in which he talked about a trip he'd taken to the Library of Congress. Timothy Ryback visited the library because he wanted to examine what he described to be 1,200 or so books that had been taken from Hitler's library at the end of the Second World War. The books had been archived in Washington, D.C., and essentially over the course of time had been largely forgotten. Timothy decided to go and take a look to see if there was anything new or of interest to discuss in those books. And he did find something that was new and of interest. Timothy Ryback discovered that around 10% of Hitler's library of books were actually books talking about the subject of spirituality, occult practices, and religious ideology. One book that Timothy Ryback found was a book about magic that had been written by a fellow called Dr. Ernst Schertl. The book contained a handwritten dedication to Adolf Hitler by the author, and the book turned out to possibly be the single book that Hitler appears to have read more than any other in his collection. It was very heavily annotated with his own comments and references, and its pages were heavily worn, like it had been read repeatedly over a very long period of time. And there was a very brief but highly significant passage that had been clearly marked by Hitler in a way that made it stand out from many of the other annotations that he'd made inside that book. The passage read as follows, and I quote, "He who does not carry demonic seeds within him will never give birth to a new world." There were other passages in the book that appeared to be of key interest to Hitler that had been highlighted in ways that made them stand out. And most of those passages were similar in nature, implying or even blatantly stating that in order for magic to successfully take place, a person assuming the role of magician must be demonic in nature and imaginative or creative in their demonic ways, because it's the demon seed within them that will make them great and will give them the power to change the status quo and lead humanity into a new world. Since Timothy Ryback's articles published in Atlantic Monthly, it has transpired that Adolf Hitler also acted out other types of interest in the occult, and he also promoted religious or occult theories to other people in his social circles and Nazi party members when he believed that those theories could work to his advantage, or if they reinforced his views and the power of the Nazi movement. So he was very interested in the occult. So that's our backstory. It all began with the 25-year expedition of the world and its occult teachings by Helena Blavatsky, which resulted in a book called The Secret Doctrine, which drew from ancient Hindu philosophies and mystical encounters and what Helena described to be timeless wisdoms that had been dictated to her by ascendant masters. It was a book about how humanity has evolved through the ages and how the cosmos was created. However, as with many things, by pure chance of circumstance, it was later, after Helena Blavatsky's death, it was mutilated and represented as a theory on how the Germans, but not only just any Germans, just the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans, were a superior Aryan race of pure blood who were destined to rule a new world order, 100% fabricated. The Aryan theory of the Nazis bears zero resemblance to Helena's book or to anything coming out of the Theosophical Society. And if you want to thank any of the idiots that feature in today's episode, I vote that you thank Guido von List first, the self-entitled man who sat around for a year feeling sorry for himself and deciding to big up his sense of self-worth by diminishing the intelligently thought through revelatory writings of Helena Blavatsky and instead turning her principles into a cheapened argument similar to what you see on reality TV these days. I guess it's kind of fitting to align this story to reality TV. I mean, this entire story so far reminds me of how the Big Brother TV reality show evolved over time. Season 1 was really interesting. It was about putting ordinary people into a confined area for a few months and then watching to see how human nature would reveal itself over time. I mean, that is interesting. But by the time we got to season 4 or 5 or later on, the ordinary housemates had been replaced with celebrities. And then within a few years of that, you couldn't get into the Big Brother house unless you had fake boobs and fish lips and maybe even a few sex videos floating around the internet. The Aryan race theory had turned into season 10 of Big Brother. And the result was a hunger for world domination by a man who believed that being evil was the secret to making magic happen. One of Hitler's highest ranking fellow Nazis was a fellow by the name of Heinrich Himmler. Himmler also had a strong interest in the occult, and together with the centralized support of the Thule Society of Idiots, the Nazi movement produced a new ideology and propaganda focused on cleansing the world of Jews and other unpure in their mind races of human, often incorporating mystical or religious reasons to support its ideology. So the concept of magic and demonic seed allowed Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler to also pursue connection to a spiritual force that would help them in their ambitions of achieving Aryan world domination. And so at this point, this takes us into the realm of theories relating to World War II and the advanced technological achievements of Nazi Germany. So, yes, during World War II, the Nazis seemed somehow to always be at the forefront of technological innovation. They always had everyone guessing. They managed somehow to develop advanced weaponry and technology that was well ahead of its time, or at least well ahead of the advancement of other nations. For example, the V2 rocket, developed by a fellow called Werner von Braun for the Nazis, was the first long-range guided ballistic missile. In fact, the Nazis created what is now the groundwork aspect of guided missile technology that's used around the world even today. The Nazis were also pioneers in jet engine technology, which led to the development of the first operational jet-powered aircraft. German Nazi engineers also developed the earliest versions of night vision devices, which were used by the Nazi military forces during the war. And the first helicopter was also developed in Nazi Germany. There was a lot of secrecy around the technological advancements achieved by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And yes, they were very ambitious and they strived for military superiority. But stories began to sort of appear and evolve about Adolf Hitler potentially having agreed to collaborate with highly advanced entities that weren't actually human. And one of those most enduring theories around this is the hollow earth hypothesis. So let's go into that a little bit. The hollow earth theory provides that both the North and South poles contain large, hidden openings that lead to a vast interior world. In some versions of this theory, it's believed that the inner underground worlds, accessed by entering the Earth via either the North or the South Pole concealed entrances, leads to a civilization of extraterrestrial beings that have either always lived underground on Earth or have migrated there from other areas of the cosmos. During World War II, both Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler also believed that something along the lines of this theory was likely to be true. Himmler, in particular, was obsessed with the idea of miracle technology, something that could wipe out competing forces in the war, something that was miraculous in nature. What we do know, in addition to the advanced technologies that were achieved by the Nazis during this period, advancements far beyond the reach of other nations, well, we also know that the Nazis conducted a variety of expeditions to the North and South Pole, particularly to Antarctica. They were reported to be searching for concealed entrances to the hollow earth. These expeditions were part of a broader interest that Hitler and Himmler had in ancient knowledge and some of the occult writings that claimed that beings of advanced ability had resided on Earth long before our current time, particularly during the time of the Atlanteans. This actually does appear to coincide with what Helena Blavatsky wrote in The Secret Doctrine about how the guardians of Earth set out to destroy the Atlanteans, who had become evil sorcerers that needed to be eliminated for the protection of the Earth and also the wider cosmos. If you're just joining us in today's episode, you might want to go back and listen to that episode. You can find aspects of that part of the story in part 2 of this trilogy. So it's theorized that, in fact, the Nazis did indeed find one of the entrances to the Hollow Earth and did make contact with otherworldly beings who they ultimately collaborated with for the purposes of gaining advanced technological advantage. What I find interesting about this theory is that it coincides with other theories that exist out there. So, for example, Marshall Vian Summers' theories about the guardians of humanity, which we have covered in a previous episode of the show. Well, he claims that he was visited by an angelic presence and warned of evil alien beings that reside underground, who represent the dark forces that want to divide and conquer humanity, and that they're working with humans here on Earth to keep us from being able to evolve as a race. And also Chris Bledsoe, who claimed that he's been continually in contact with a guardianship style of angelic presence that he refers to as the Lady in White, who warns him of dark forces that want to control humanity and keep us away from the light of love. And the tactic that they use is fear. I mean, there's also something more recent that occurred under the codename Operation Paperclip, involving something that's actually dated just after the Roswell incident in the 1940s, in which the United States actually recruited a number of German scientists to be able to learn from the technological advancements that had been demonstrated during the Second World War and brought them to the United States to study. They were there was a situation that occurred in which I describe it in far more detail in one of my previous episodes, in which a battle was taking place between the Americans over these scientists and the Russians, I believe, somewhere in the North Pole region. And at that moment in time, there was an intervention of what's described to be a number of unidentified UFOs that kind of was thrown into the mix. If you want more information on Operation Paperclip, this is not the place to be able to look at that, although I do go into detail in other episodes. But for the purposes of this episode, it just shows that there is ongoing theories about the connection between the North Pole and this extraterrestrial activity. All of the theories, regardless of which countries or which aspects of faith, whether supernatural or religious or anything else that they come from, they all warn of a dark force, often residing underground, that is competing with forces of light and love to control our existence. And the dark forces use tactics of fear and oppression, division and war to help to keep us under control. Always running in a circle on a treadmill. That's what they want. They want us never to be able to rise above our current realm of existence. And we mustn't forget that even Helena Blavatsky wrote about the cycle of evolution and how each stage of the cycle of evolution of humanity must involve the extinction of the existing race in order for the new, more highly evolved race to be born. She explained that the Great Flood and the destruction of the great giants that appear in the Bible and other Abrahamic religious texts are actually testimony to this very fact, and that dark must compete with the light throughout our evolution, and that humanity sometimes gets stuck in the dark and requires a third-party intervention. But these past 3 episodes in this trilogy seem to definitely show that the cycle of stories of what's happening in the world haven't changed much over the years and even over the decades. I'm tending to believe that there is something out there that must exist in order to continuously take us down a similar path of exploration and evolution, regardless of whether we were born in the 1800s or the 1900s or the 20th or even the 21st century. And what I find to be disappointing, no, actually, it's not disappointing. I think that's the wrong word. It's sort of tragic. What I find to be tragic and disturbing is how some aspects of humanity have a way of turning the most beautiful exploration of who we are and why we're here into a feature of ugliness and trauma and cruelty. A bit like Big Brother episode 10 was 10th season. Imagine how sick a man like Adolf Hitler must have been to believe that to be a great person, you must also be possessed by a demon seed. And I mean, you don't have to believe me. The book in question won't be named by me in this episode for obvious reasons, but it has been republished with Hitler's annotations included in the publication. And it's considered to be something of interest to white supremacists even today. I wonder how many of them realize that their marvelously superior Aryan race that they are desperately latching onto in order to prove to themselves that they are worthy is actually derived from dark-skinned origin, arising from the Himalayan regions of Tibet, the Indian subcontinent, and the peaceful Hindu and Buddhist faiths. Even that symbol that they wear proudly is black in origin. It's ironic, isn't it? Yep, the world does indeed have its share of idiots, but I also wonder if under the earth there might also be a share of otherworldly beings. Because this trilogy was all about demonstrating the interconnectedness of everything, the spirituality and occult wisdoms derived from Helena Blavatsky's travel over 25 years, together with the evilness of men who were desperately trying to prove themselves to be more than they actually are. And then this concept of otherworldly beings and guardians of the earth coming from elsewhere in the cosmos to protect an interest of some kind and keep evolution going. It's a big question mark, but it's something that keeps repeating itself in lots of different ways, in lots of different stories. Well, I guess it all boils down to this, and that is that every new episode here on this show is another opportunity to find out more as we scratch the surface. My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.